when I left office, I went to CSU, started the center. It's called the Center for the New Energy Economy. And our whole premise was that Congress was not actually going to do much on energy policy in a very comprehensive way. This was back in 2011. You didn't have to be a Mensa scholar, right, to understand that, because at the time it appeared that a lot about Congress was stalemating. Turned out I was pretty right about that, and I wasn't alone. There were a lot of people saying that. And if anything, the situation in Congress has gotten far worse than it was in 2011. If you get an opportunity, read the book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. It is a book about the United States Congress. It's written by a liberal and a conservative, Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, and one's at Brookings, the other one's at the American Enterprise Institute. And basically, it tells you why there's not comprehensive legislation passing through the United States Congress. There's a major energy efficiency bill last year called Shaheen-Portman. It had a majority support and bipartisan support and could not pass through the Congress. You're like, majority, bipartisan support? And so much of it had to do with needing to get 60 votes to push it, and then all these other sort of legislative, the trickery that goes on where they were going to tie a variety of amendments in an election year and get up or down votes on things like the Keystone Pipeline. And so it wound up not moving at all, that had majority bipartisan support and would be really a significant bill in allowing a variety of things to happen, including some other kinds of financing instruments, both for renewables and for energy efficiency. So we did a thing for the President of the United States, my center did, my staff did, called Powering Forward, where the White House asked us to make recommendations about how the President could move a clean energy agenda without actually having to rely upon Congress. And it was not about trying to use more executive authority than he's entitled to constitutionally, but really, how do you move an agenda with your agencies, with the power that they already have, and the White House with the power that it has. So we wrote this report. They said we want everything, including the kitchen sink. So we have 200 recommendations, knowing that there's no way they could get them done. They've had it now for about a year, a little over a year. And, they have until the end of the president's term, but really probably not even the end of the term before they will be done with sort of their biggest things. But there's a variety of the recommendations that we've made that the administration has moved upon, and those have to do with sort of the energy policy part of his climate agenda. So the president has the climate agenda that he announced June the 25th of 2013, and we began our process July of 2013, reported back January of 2014. If you're interested, look at it. It's called Powering Forward, and it was about energy efficiency, renewable energy, alternative fuels for vehicles, different business models for utilities, and then rulemaking on natural gas, and what's the federal role for rulemaking on natural gas. So those are the things that were in that report. So our other work, and really our core work now, is to work with states around the country on a variety of energy policy issues. And we very much try and work with Democrats and Republicans. And so there's some big things happening, and we're involved in a couple of those, and I want to just talk to you about some of those things, and then we'll talk about Colorado, and then we'll open it up to questions. Probably the biggest thing happening in energy policy at the state level across the United States has to do with what the EPA called the Clean Power Plan when they proposed it last June. So early last June, the EPA put out the Clean Power Plan, and actually the president in that same climate speech in June of 2013 said he was directing the EPA to propose for existing sources, which meant basically coal plants, electric generating units that were fired by coal. He was announcing that the EPA was going to propose an emissions rule. Well, the EPA did something very different than they've done probably on any other occasion under the Clean Air Act. They used their authority under the Clean Air Act, but they decided upon a remedy that would be what's called outside the fence line. They weren't just going to look at the electric generating unit. They weren't just going to look at the amount of emissions of that coal unit and say you got to take that down, or you got to scrub it, or you got to do these kinds of things. They said you can also use new natural gas, you can use renewable energy, and you can use energy efficiency called outside the fence line to get to this emissions reduction that we're asking you to put in place by 2030. And then what they did was they went state by state by state, and they said to every state, this is your goal. So not every state got a 30% goal. That became the average The state of Washington has a 74% goal. The state of Colorado, I think it's a 23% goal. The state of Wyoming has like a 21% goal. And so they really looked at your coal-fired generation and what was possible, what kinds of things you could actually do in getting those emissions numbers down. They looked at the possibility of doing it through something that's called rate-based versus mass-based. It's a little esoteric now. I'm getting into the weeds on it, but it's a pretty complicated rule. It was 500 or 600 pages. It mentioned Colorado and the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, which Senator Schwartz was a part of getting through the Senate at the time. Mentioned it several times as a template for how states can tackle taking down coal-fired generation and transitioning it, and really use both the process and the result as an example of how to do this. And so what we did in looking at this was, and this came partly from our Powering Forward work, where people said, we know the EPA is going to propose this rule, and what we're telling you is we're nervous that states are not going to have enough flexibility, they're not going to have enough time. So we began talking to the EPA and saying, this is what we're hearing from our little convenings that we did with these 110 subject matter experts that led to Powering Forward recommendations. And as a part of that, then we began working with the EPA to convene stakeholders prior to their proposal. After the proposal, I went to the Western Governors Association, and I said to the Western Governors, listen, I know some of you are opposed to this. This was North Dakota, South Dakota, and every state west. So think of the 13 states that are the Dakotas and every state west. Said, I know some of you are opposed to it. The state of Wyoming had already dedicated money to sue the EPA over the rule. I said, listen, there are things that we in the West should care about where this rule is concerned. There are both concerns and there are likely to be benefits to the West if this rule is implemented. So you've got a legal strategy, but you need a hedge strategy so that the EPA doesn't come in and plan for you, state of Wyoming, plan for you how you take down your emissions. And at the end of the day, all 13 of the states agreed to be convened. And so we are working with all of those western states, including the state of Colorado. The energy and environment leads from those states have been coming to the convening since last July. We had 100% participation. We wrote a comment letter, and the comment letter had 10 of the 13 governors signing onto the bottom line saying, these are some of the things that concern us about this rule. These are some of the things we hope you might look at and even change in the final rule, which is coming later this summer. We then began convening the utilities. So we met with the EPA and the CEO of the major utilities in the West, and then even added more utilities to that meeting and had another meeting just a few weeks ago with the lead author of that rule. And what we're going to do next is intersect our convenings for the utility CEOs. They have a whole set of concerns different than the states have. The utilities are actually going to be holding the the bag at the end of it all, because it's likely that utilities are the ones that will be held liable for not getting to the place they need to on electric generation emissions. States certainly will look to utilities to help plan, but there is a lot of power that crosses borders in the West. There is a thing called a balancing authority in the West that allows you to kind of wheel power around and balance loads, and that's an important feature in the West that makes us sort of unique with the rest of the country. And then, really finally, there's a lot of coal-fired generation that's moved across state lines. So imagine the state of Wyoming, the state of Montana. They both export a lot of coal, and there are states that they export it to that have already said, we're going to end coal coming over the wires. Particularly the state of Washington, the state of Oregon has been sort of pushing that. And so you have a real concern about the assets that will be stranded, both as a result of the rule or as a result of what other states are doing to sort of end their intake of coal, and we're part of this process. Now, I think in the State House, and this may have been one of the things, Anna, that you guys talked about, there was a bill to say in that 111D process, we're going to require that whatever 111D plan the state puts together, it has to pass muster in both houses by 2/3 support. You haven't talked about that yet. So there is that bill. It's not likely to, if it hasn't been PI'd, it will be. So I don't think it's ultimately going to survive. But this is happening in states around the country, and it is actually passed in some states where, the governor puts together his what's called 111D plan. It was really how they're going to reduce their emissions in this serious way by 2020, and then the legislature saying, we want to get involved in this. We want to be part of deciding and screening what the plan looks like. So there's a few different states. Pennsylvania in the fall passed a bill that said it has to pass muster in both houses in order for it to actually survive as the state's 111D plan. In Colorado, I don't know what will happen ultimately with the legislation. I don't think it'll pass, but what I do know is the stakeholders are involved. The utilities are involved. The power providers, including Tri-State, are involved in thinking about this. And of course, some people are going to be happier with this rule than others. If you've moved your emissions down over the last several years, then you might like this rule better than if you've made a big bet on coal-fired emissions, because that's really what the rule is trying to tackle, particularly if in the case of Tri-State you have new generation, fairly new relative to the rest of the country. They have new coal-fired generation, and so there are going to have to be ways where we try and figure out how to protect those assets and at the same time, as a state, get those emissions to a place where we can really say we've reduced them as the EPA has asked us to or required to. So there is pushback in legislatures across the country. I think Arizona actually put something in their constitution after November that basically says they can't follow any federal mandate. So, you know, it's pretty blanket, and it's a little bit like what's happening in Arizona largely anyway. And yet we have the state of Arizona and the two major utilities working with us in our convenings talking about the ways to actually do this. We have a very constructive conversation going on inside. The other thing I want to talk about is renewable energy standards. Then we're going to go to questions. There was a bill that I know has been postponed indefinitely, and that's how a bill ends. That's the end of its life in this building when a bill is PI'd. It was to take our renewable energy standard from 30 down to 15, and for rurals from 20, I think, also down to 15. So the 30% standard applies to XL. And I'll just tell you a story from this week. I was up at the Vail Energy Forum, and it was a nice mix of people from the oil and gas world and the clean energy world. Condoleezza Rice was our keynote speaker. I was speaking on Saturday afternoon at a panel, and the woman introducing the panel, it was kind of a energy mix panel, and the woman introducing the panel said, well, I want to start off just by asking you, and she keyed this up. We knew it was coming. Just give us a number that you really think people should know about. Just one number, just in a sentence about it. And I said, well, I'm not just going to give you one number. As a former governor, you still get to decide once in a while to expand the question. I said, I'm going to give you several numbers: 30, 22, 1, 2, 35. I said, what's that? So we passed in 2010 in this building a bill, and I don't know, Senator, if did you carry it? God bless you, Gail Schwartz. So we passed the bill that was a 30% renewable energy standard for the state of Colorado. It wound up being the second highest renewable energy standard in America. Of course, this is an adversarial process, so there were a lot of people saying you'll never get there. And they said even if you get there, you know, you're going to have all sorts of reliability problems. And even with the reliability problems, you're also never going to be able to make this affordable. This is going to cost customers so much. So 30% standard, that was my 30. 20 was 2020. That was the date that we said it had to be passed by. We had a 20% standard for 2020, and we were going to 30%. And the 2 was the 2% rate cap that we put in place where a utility couldn't charge more than 2% to really pay for the renewables that they put on the grid. So that was the first part of it. The second part of it, the 1, was we took 1 gigawatt the same year of coal-fired generation under Clean Air, Clean Jobs, and we transitioned it to natural gas. We said we want to reduce the NOx and the SOx by, well, the NOx and the SOx by 70 and 80%, eliminate the mercury in that 1 gigawatt of power, and create some jobs actually doing it, because there's natural gas is a fairly significant part of the Colorado economy. The 2 is the result of the hearing that the PUC just had about our Clean Air, Clean Jobs. It was the most recent. They finished really all of the regulatory work as a part of Clean Air, Clean Jobs and found that it's going to cost customers $2 a month. Now, what I'll tell you is after I left office, there were people who were going to other commissions around the country saying this was going to cost consumers in Colorado at least 20%. So if you're paying a $100 bill, it was going to be $120 on your electricity bill, and instead of $120, it's $102. So what we did in this state was advance this really serious clean energy agenda, and still do, but we advanced a serious agenda that got us to a 30% renewable energy standard that took a gigawatt of coal and transitioned it to natural gas. And you say, well, what was the outcome of that? That's that last number, 35. If you look at XL's coal-fired or carbon emissions, not their coal-fired, but their carbon emissions, from 2005 and you go forward to 2020, they're reducing their emissions by 35%, from 05 to 2020. No utility in America can look at that same time frame and actually say in a state they did more to reduce their emissions than Xcel Energy. And so it was done with a lot of opposition. It was done with a variety of people telling us, well, it couldn't be done, and it was going to, cost this amount of money, and we weren't going to protect ratepayers, and we weren't going to have integration, and that wound up not being true. It's not like this transition's an easy transition. Utilities really have to work at having the right technology in place to do the integration that's required, but the fact of the matter is that it wound up happening, and it wound up working, and the result of that is a 35% reduction in emissions. If we as a nation were sort of on that same glide path and we're moving in lockstep and we weren't locked down politically in trying to fight this fight about what's good and what's bad and we could absolutely as a nation do that, and we would be on the glide path to do the 80% reduction in emissions that we need by 2050. And that's just something to sit and ponder a bit, because we hear so much about the fight and so much about the inactivity, and we have examples other than Colorado, of states that have actually moved agendas where they've seen those kinds of significant reductions in emissions and have actually mapped out how states can do it and how we can do it as a nation. The EPA has put in place the Clean Power Plan, so it comes as sort of a command and control. There will be litigation about it. There will be a lot of naysayers about it, but the fact of the matter is it can be done. We've seen in this country several bills across the country that have tried to roll back those renewable energy standards, the renewable portfolio standards, because there's a group of folks that want to see those go away. And they've largely been unsuccessful. Ohio finally put a moratorium on their renewable energy standard last year, but we think that probably is going to come back because there's a business case in Ohio. It's a very strong business case. And we always said we were going to also create jobs doing this, and it's one anecdote, but Vestas came, built 4 plants here, 2,400 jobs. They just announced they're going to do another 400 jobs in addition to the maximum number of jobs they said they were going to bring to Colorado back in 2008. So I know that there are things that are controversial in this building, and I know that there's a lot of, headbutting that can go on. But what's interesting is when you can move an agenda and when you try and think about it in terms of how you protect the people of Colorado and how you protect ratepayers, but at the same time get the utilities on board, you can actually do the kinds of things that we were able to. And for my purposes, I think when we talk about sustainability, there are a whole variety of ways to talk about that issue of sustainability, but energy production may be among the top 2 or 3 among them if we're tackling environment, public health, and climate change. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and we'll go to questions if you have them.